Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with random book reviews from the Overflow Room Annex. And I have a bunch, three books. I'm sort of covering three books at a time, which probably means we'll be able to keep doing this for the next 50 or 60 years. But these are mostly books on history. And they're books on history because they were involved, because I was involved at the time in research on my first master's thesis, the topic of which was Der Fall Hindemith, the Hindemith case, the affair that got Hindemith and Furtwängler tangled up with the Nazi regime over the premiere of his symphony, Matthäus der Maler. It's a very, very interesting topic. And in order to do that, of course, I was actually a German historian for most of my academic career, Germany and France, but mostly Germany. And these were some of the books that I read and researched and enjoyed in working on that topic. And you might enjoy them too. I don't know. I mean, it's entirely up to you. The first is an absolute classic by Friedrich Meinecke, who was one of the great German historians from the early decades of the 20th century and the end of the 19th century. It's Cosmopolitanism and the National State, which was first published in German in 1907, if I'm not mistaken. This is a fascinating book because it deals with the intellectual underpinnings of the rise of German nationalism, when we all know where that wound up in the 20th century. And so but it was written before any of that happened. And so it's a very, very interesting view because it's untouched by the corrupting influence, if you want to call it that, of later events. And Meinecke speaks very eloquently of the intellectual foundations of German statehood, particularly Fichte and other great German philosophers and historians from the 19th century. So I'm not suggesting that you rush out and buy this immediately. This is part of Princeton University Press Legacy Library, but it is a very, very valuable book for understanding what the main intellectual currents operative in Germany were, especially in the latter half of the 19th century. And it was important for the study of Furtwängler because Furtwängler's parents were academics who operated and worked in that intellectual milieu, and he was very much a part of it. So yeah, that was that one. Then there was this one, The Rise of Political Anti-Semitism in Germany and Austria, by Peter Pulzer. A really very, very probing study, especially of Austria, of anti-Semitism in those countries. And it should become the standard account of anti-Semitism as a political movement in Central Europe. The value of this book lies both in its completeness and in the clarity of its analyses. That's written by George Mossey, who I knew and who I had hoped to study with at the University of Wisconsin, but he was ill at the time and retired and whatnot. So, but he was one of the also great historians of this period. I became fascinated by this, not just because I'm Jewish, by the way, but because it directly, you cannot study or enjoy the music of this period, the 19th century particularly, without coming to grips with Wagner and Wagner's anti-Semitism, and Brahms and his circle, who were not anti-Semitic, and and the whole intellectual underpinnings of political anti-Semitism, which were just so unbelievably stupid. It's just horrible. It really is. But music comes into it. It comes into this because there were a lot of Jewish musicians. Joachim, for example, was a major one. Mahler was a major one, and their careers are intermingled with this whole story. And so I became fascinated with it from a cultural musical angle. And Mahler's in here. Let me see. He's on page 13. We just saw. Let's see where he's mentioned. Oh, yes, here we go. The economic and political influence of Jews during these decades paled besides their complete domination of Viennese cultural life in the generation before 1914. It's not merely that the Jews provided the patronage, the audience, and by press criticism, the canons of taste. they provided also the creators. Arthur Schnitzler, Stefan Zweig, Franz Werfel, Gustav Mahler was appointed director of the opera in 1898, which made him musical dictator of the city. Lewinsky and Sonnenthal scintillated on the boards of the Burgtheater. Heinrich Friedjung was the doyen of historians. Beside them were others like Sigmund Freud and Arnold Schoenberg, whose genius was not established beyond controversy. Jewish talent bloomed as vigorously as it did in Grenada under Muslim rule. This was the nursery of anti-Semitism. That fascinated me. And this book fascinated me, and it still does. It's a splendid, splendid study. So once again, that's The Rise of Political Anti-Semitism in Germany and Austria by Peter Pulzer. Definitely worth exploring if you're interested in the culture of the period, the ferment that was Austrian cultural life. Then we've got Furtwängler by Hans Hubert Schönzeller. This was the sort of basic biography of Furtwängler. The foreword is by Yehudi Menuhin. It was originally written, let me see. Oh my goodness. Let's see. This is first published in 1990. Yeah, 1990. And it's a pretty straightforward, sensible guide, I think. It's not particularly probing or critical, but it's interesting enough. And Furtwängler at the time, that I was doing my study, which was in the 80s. This came later, by the way. But when I was doing, my study in the 80s, had not become the cult figure that he is today or was. I don't know. I don't know what's happening with his cult lately. I haven't checked in on them recently, but he hadn't become quite the thing. And so biography of him wasn't as critical, and it really wasn't as thorough as I think it later became, or study of him wasn't as thorough, because there still really isn't, I think, a definitive biography. There are essays and scholarly papers on Furtwängler. It was, of course, an extraordinarily interesting character and a symbol beyond his abilities as a musician. And so I've continued to be interested in the topic, and it's very funny, when we have these fights online, about his value as a musician and what he did and what he thought and whether he was really a Nazi or not a Nazi and all that. And I'm always struck by just how shallow most people's view of him is in terms of their information on his milieu and his way of thinking and whatnot. It's a fascinating topic. It is, and he's a fascinating character, a deeply flawed but deeply interesting character, and a deeply flawed but also deeply interesting musician. And so these three books were all inextricably entwined with my interest in music and German culture and Austrian culture and the fin de siècle period, which was my specialty when I was working on my first master's degree at Johns Hopkins University. And it was a wonderful time, a time of learning and thought. And, there's a lot to be said for being able to devote yourself in a completely unfettered way to study, to just expanding your knowledge. And those were some of the books that did it for me. And there will be others as we get through them, because I'm not limiting myself just to only music and musicians, but things also related to music and musicians and culture more generally, because I think the bigger picture is also absolutely fascinating. And I know that some of you do too. So keep on reading, friends, and listening. Thanks for joining me. Take care.